Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Canna Pop Up podcast. My name is Robert Allen. We're exclusively on the CannaCast network, and this is one of our inaugural podcasts for our Canna Pop Up events. We're very excited about being able to bring you edutainment, information, food, infusions, networking, all things involving the canna culture for all of you who are canna curious. And I couldn't think of a better way to start off our podcast series than with our guest today, who's the Marijuana Mommy. It's kind of an oxymoron if you think about that, but we're going to learn why it isn't. So Jessie Gill, who's with us today, has a very interesting background in holistic health and hospice care. She's actually a cannabis nurse, and we'll learn more about that and her story and how she came to be the Marijuana Mommy. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce you and welcome our guest today, Jessie Gill. Jessie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, Robert. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Well, we've been learning a lot about you in our time leading up to our podcast, and I'm very excited to have you a part of it because you really do lend a very interesting perspective to cannabis as medicine in helping people with what ails them. And as we'll learn, marijuana and CBD especially is somewhat magical in a sense in some of the things that it does. But before we get started into finding out and exposing some of these myths and misunderstandings about cannabis, why don't you give our viewers just a little bit of a sense of who you are and your background?
Sure. I'm a registered nurse, and about 4 years ago I was working as a hospice nurse and I was injured. I suffered a spinal injury that ended my bedside career. And, I started this really complex journey to try to heal. And unfortunately, I never quite did. I had a multi-level spinal fusion, which made me worse. I received all of the standard treatments and pharmaceuticals. And I was taking opiates and Valium around the clock, so every 6 to 8 hours, and a whole bunch of other pharmaceuticals. And this was about 2 years ago, and they said there was nothing else they could do for me. And my mom really pushed me to try cannabis, and I was very, very reluctant. I honestly didn't believe that it could help me. I was using so many pharmaceuticals, and I was like, if those didn't help, how could a plant help? And my mom really, really encouraged me, and the day that I tried it, I was able to stop the opiates and the Valium that same day, and then slowly able to stop my other pharmaceuticals. And, it hasn't healed me. I'm not magically better. I still have tons of challenges and issues, but it is a way better treatment than anything else I ever tried, and I tried a lot. So I was kind of blown away, and, I knew that if as a nurse, as a hospice nurse, as a pain specialist, that if I didn't understand how beneficial this plant could be, then there were a lot of other people out there who needed the knowledge, and I figured my story could help. And that's when I started Marijuana Mommy, to help share my story and to help teach about medical marijuana.
Well, I commend you for that because really we know that we really can't claim that this treats or cures anything, but the anecdotal evidence is there. I mean, we see people being helped, and I think now more than ever we need to be in control of our own health care. And there are things that are perfectly legal right now that can kill you, and yet there's a relatively harmless plant that can do a lot of help, and yet we can't have access to that. And I think a lot of that is about misunderstanding and myths. So why don't we start off by the basics, right? Let's talk about what is the difference between hemp and marijuana? Where does the distinction lie?
Sure. So, that's a common question. So it's kind of like all marijuana is hemp, but not all hemp is marijuana. So they're, they're members of the same group of plants. They're very similar, but when we think of it in layman's terms, and what we refer to in the industry as hemp, tends to be products that contain less than a certain percentage of THC. And when we can think about marijuana, it tends to be the plants that have a higher percentage of THC. Now, THC is the most popular and famous cannabinoid out of all the cannabinoids. It's the most well known, but it's not the only one. There's over 113 different cannabinoids that have been identified, and they're not even all named yet. So it's just one of the many. But hemp itself, it contains many cannabinoids. It just doesn't contain that much THC.
And what's, you said something very interesting, because we're really learning all the time about how this can help and the types of things that it's able to treat. So does a lot of that come down to the science? Because we talk about that, there are certain strains that are helpful for certain things or certain times of day, right? Because when this is being used as medicine, and I myself use this after a hip replacement versus the bottle of opioids that my doctor handed me as I left the hospital. So, you need to have this medicine in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and if you are using the THC component, that can affect how you are. So talk a little bit about how from the medical perspective, different strains are dialed in to treat different things.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most common misconceptions, that all marijuana is the same. That, and I hear this all the time. People will be like, "Oh, my doctor said just go buy a joint and get high and see if it works." And I'm like, that's not how you do it, because there are different strains, exactly as you said, different strains that tend to help more people with specific issues. Now, the one difficult thing about cannabis and treatment with medical marijuana is it's highly individualized. So how a strain affects me can affect you totally differently. So it's really, really important for people to try different things. But we tend to see certain ones, for example, will cause more of a body high, a physical relaxation, which can be amazing for pain and spasms. Whereas we'll see some other strains that, can kind of help energize people and, give them focus and energy. And this is often great for patients who suffer from depression. So it's really, really important for patients to understand that not all marijuana is the same, but that every strain can affect everybody differently.
As a parent, right? We're parents here. Are concerned because as we talk about legalization for adult use, and at the age of 21, right, when people are still developing and young, we talk about usage, how we realistically, right, in the spectrum of things that are available to us, how dangerous is cannabis?
It's a good question. So again, we're very limited by our research. We know that it's not a completely benign substance. It's not, obviously it has physiological effects. That's why people use it medically. That's why people use it recreationally. But we haven't been able to study it for, decades. So we don't have accurate data to really, really clearly explain it. But the data that we do have, and the data that's coming out, suggests that the safety obviously has been, the risks have been blown way out of proportion. It's not nearly as dangerous as it's been presented. So it depends on which area you're talking about. Now, there was a recent, it was a comparative analysis published in 2015 that compared cannabis to a whole arrangement of other substances like tobacco and cocaine and alcohol. And, by those estimates alone, it found that marijuana is 114 times less deadly than alcohol, which is just remarkable. So, compared to alcohol, it is dramatically safer. You cannot die from cannabis. You cannot die from a cannabis overdose.
Right.
88,000 people a year die from alcohol.
Right.
So compared to that, it's safer. Then you do, like you mentioned, being a parent, and there are concerns about, does it increase the risk for psychosis? So there's some data to suggest that possibly if kids use it in adolescence, it may increase their risk of psychosis in adulthood. And as a parent, we want to do everything to give our kids the edge and give our kids the benefit and give them every possibility in life. So we're going to do everything we can to protect them. At the same time, whereas we see that might be a risk, if you look at the research, moving in childhood can cause the same risk of the increased risk of psychosis and equivalent to cannabis. It's I believe a 2 to 3% increase in risk. I mean, it's the same for living in an urban development, an urban area dramatically raises the risk for psychosis. Sure. So, I mean, compared to other things, it's not as dangerous. Sure, there are dangers, but
right. And the word addiction comes up all the time, right? Mm-hmm. And if we want to talk about addiction, right, then let's talk about it across the board. Let's talk about sugar addiction. Let's talk about, like you said, tobacco or alcohol, right? So shopping, we have to learn
gambling.
Yeah, we have to learn how to be in control of all of those things, right? We can't, take this one thing that some people may use, even if it's just recreationally, much the way someone might take a beer or a glass of wine. You have to be in control of that, of your intake and what you do and how responsible you are. And it's interesting because one of the things, we had just come back from the Normal conference in advance of Lobby Day in Washington, and there was a study shown about driving under the influence. And the evidence showed that people who were under the influence of cannabis versus alcohol were far more cautious when driving and were more inclined to say, hey, you know what? I'm a little bit too high. I'm not driving. Whereas, with alcohol, just the opposite, that carelessness becomes. So I think putting it all into perspective and doing that. And now when we look at it, right, of the consumption, of how many people need this medicine, whether it's available in their state as medical marijuana in a marijuana program, or the necessity of getting it on, what's known as the black market, right, the underground, from your local drug dealer, right? It's amazing that we're forced to do that in this country in this day and age, to go put ourselves at risk when I can go to Walgreens or CVS and pick up Tylenol for my headache without having to register for anything or tell anyone I'm using this particular medication to get rid of my headache, and I can grow tomatoes in my backyard. But cannabis is a very evil plant, apparently. So.
I say all the time, as a hospice nurse, I was able to walk into any pharmacy, well, not any pharmacy, but many, many pharmacies, and I could walk out within 15 minutes with a bottle of morphine, with very, very little checks and not even a physical prescription. And, they've cracked down on it a little bit more since then. But, to get medical marijuana, it's a small fortune in New Jersey, and you have to jump through hoops. It's bonkers.
Yes, yeah, and it shouldn't be. And we are all working towards a common goal of making this medicine available to all who desire it and all who need it, and in short order. This should not be taking, it's interesting, Normal has been on the scene for 48 years, fighting for the legalization of marijuana, to end this prohibition that we're in, and that to me is just pure insanity.
It is.
So hopefully we will see that all change in short order. Shifting gears a little bit, we are very excited that you will be part of our upcoming pop-up event.
Yes, I'm very excited about
that. At the end of September 27th. I encourage everyone to head on over to cannapopup.com for more information on that. But how can our viewers find out a little bit more about you and Marijuana Mommy? Where can they go to?
You can come by marijuanamommy.com. You'll find everything right there.
Perfect. So, Jessie, thank you so much for spending the time with us today and helping to dispel some of the myths and the stigma attached to this, because it really does not make a whole lot of sense. And I am proud to be aligned with people like yourself who are on this crusade to end this modern day prohibition and to let more people be helped by this plant. So
It's time.
thank you. Yeah, it is time. That's perfect.
And
So,
thank you for what you guys are doing, and thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
well, it was a pleasure, and we're looking forward to seeing you at our Canna Pop Up in Montclair on September 27th. So thank you.